Welcome to Season 2 of Telling Tales. This season we meet up with some old friends and make some new ones. I'll take you on adventures through time, visit mysteries and answer questions such as where does Mustafa Khan go next? And what happened to John Paul Docherty? Welcome to Telling Tales Season 2, written and presented by me, Jeff Price. John Paul Docherty and the Mucky Mag Part 1. "John Paul, get your skinny arse up here now," Sheila Docherty shouted up the narrow staircase. "I've told you 2 times, there won't be a third." John Paul knew exactly what that would mean. His mother would be upstairs with the wooden spoon, beating the crap out of him until he got out of bed. He quickly picked up his clothes from the floor, dressed and went downstairs. "I'm out of milk. Your pa will want some for his tea when he gets in from the night shift. He'll be tired and in a bad mood, and none of us want that, do we?" She gave John Paul one of her terrifying stares. "No, Ma," John Paul replied. "Now go and don't dawdle." She swept her flat hand out towards his head, and he quickly ducked as he slipped out the door. He hated getting the milk. It was 7 in the morning, and the normally crowded terrace streets of Newcastle were just starting to come to life. In the distance he could hear the familiar rattle of the milk cart as it did its daily round. He was a few streets away from his own house. "Always keep the park between yourself and the milk," his eldest brother Sean had told him. "This is the Catholic area. You go on the other side of the park, and it's Protestant milk you're nicking." John Paul glanced about him, made sure no one could see him, and in the time it takes to say, "2 sugars, please," he scooped up a bottle of milk from a doorstep and pushed it inside his coat. His family life was a chaotic one. He had 5 brothers, his mother and father, and his grandfather sharing a 3-bedroom terraced house in the west end of the city. Mrs. Docherty came from a hard-working family and tried her best to keep the house tidy and her unruly brood in line. She provided them with good basic food. She kept their clothes as clean as she could. But it was an uphill task, and she rarely made it even halfway up. Her husband, Michael, with his shock of red hair and his quick wit, was the love of her life. He never complained. He worked hard in the chemical factory and always handed his pay packet over on a Friday night, unopened. John Paul's family's roots were in Ireland. His great-great-grandfather had brought the family to Newcastle when the potato famine gripped the country. And despite the fact his father had never set foot in Ireland, he considered himself as Irish as Guinness. The back door swung open, and Michael Docherty pushed his way through the debris that littered the backyard and opened the kitchen door. "Sheila, pet, I don't know how you managed to look so gorgeous at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm for me bed after breakfast. Would you like to join me for an hour or so?" "Away with you, Michael Docherty." She tried to suppress a smile. "Stop your messing. I've 6 breakfasts to make, and you go and get those idle sons of yours out of bed and get them ready for school." The big bedroom at the front of the house was more like an army barracks, with 2 rows of bunk beds and a small cot on which John Paul slept. It was far too small for him, but there's no way his elder brothers were going to give up their beds for him. Michael banged his fist on the bedroom door and shouted, "Up now, you lazy buggers! You're not down in 5 minutes, I'll send your ma up with the spoon." He had no desire to go in the room. The smell of teenage boys and sweaty socks was worse than the acrid smell of the chemicals cooking in the factory where he worked. The terrace streets were built in 1890 when they were for middle-class families, but now the area had become a ghetto of low-paid labourers and the unemployed. A run-down park sulked at the end of the terrace. John Paul liked the park. It was overgrown, and most of the play equipment was broken, but at night it belonged to him and his pals. The park keeper and the police would constantly try to move them on, but it was like trying to keep ants out of a sugar factory. John Paul had kissed Mary McIntyre there, and even felt her breasts through her school cardigan. He got a slap across the face for that. He decided to take the shortcut through the park. The morning air was sharp, but the April sunshine had lit up the path through the hedge. And that's where he saw the magazine. John Paul was a natural scavenger, and if someone had dumped something in the back lane, he was the first to drag it into the backyard. As a consequence, the back of the house was overgrown with abandoned washing machines, broken bicycles, and bald car tyres. If John Paul brought some discarded piece of metal or a clucked flower pot to his dad, he always got a, "That's grand, lads." Praise from his father was as rare as a sunny day in Newcastle. "You never know when something's going to come in handy," was the family motto. In reality, none of the junk piled up in the yard ever came in handy, but his father would never part with any of it, much to his wife's annoyance. So, John Paul had learned from an early age to keep his eyes peeled for treasure in the back lanes and anything dumped in the park. He couldn't believe his luck when he examined the magazine. It was an almost mint copy of Penthouse. The girly magazine had only recently come out, and the paper boys from Parker's newsagents talked of nothing else. "Tits and everything," they eagerly told anyone who would listen. He quickly stuffed it inside his coat, next to the milk bottle. Back at the house, he passed the milk bottle to his mother. "Did you have to milk a cow to get that? You've been 20 minutes, and your da's not a happy man." Before John Paul could dodge out of the way, she landed a slap across the back of his head. "Get that tea to your da. He's out in the yard in the outside netty." John Paul made his way gingerly through the debris of the small yard and knocked on the door of the outside toilet. "What do you want? I'm in here," his dad said. "Dad, have your tea." The door slowly cracked open. His father was astride the toilet, a cigarette in his mouth and a copy of the Racing Post in his lap. "About bloody time, me throat's as rough as the bottom of me work boots." As John Paul stood there, gazing at his father, with his trousers around his ankles and his cap pushed back on his head, his father swallowed a large slurp of tea and then spat it all over John Paul's trousers. "Jesus, no bloody sugar, you're trying to poison me. Take it back and put 2 sugars in it. Tell your ma I want a bacon sandwich for me breakfast." John Paul scurried back to the kitchen. But as he came through the back door, the magazine dropped out of his coat and onto the floor. As he went to pick it up, he spilled some tea on it. "No!" he screamed, and his mother spun around. She looked at the floor, then looked back at John Paul. "Where did you get that filth?" she said. And before John Paul could say anything, his mother had grabbed the precious copy of Penthouse and dumped it in the kitchen bin. Me dad wants a cup of tea with 2 sugars and a bacon sandwich, Ma." His mother stared at him with such intensity he felt as if she was burying into his head. "Get cleaned up and get off to school. I'll talk to you tonight." He hated it when that happened. All day long he'd wonder if she'd told his dad, and what would she do next. "It's the spoon for sure," he thought. His walk home from school that afternoon was slower than normal. He had no desire to see his mother or father, and no appetite for the beating that would follow. He crept into the house, and as he started to go upstairs, his mother came out of the kitchen. "John Paul, I need you to go to the co-op and get some plain flour, just 2pence worth. and she thrust 2 penny coins in his hands. I'm making a cake for your granddad. I forgot it's his birthday tomorrow. Now go. John Paul ducked, expecting the usual slap across the head, but his mother spun around and disappeared back into the kitchen. He returned from the co-op shop 10 minutes later and went into the kitchen. Here, Ma, he said, handing the flour over. Anything else? Yes, take the kitchen bin out and empty it into the big bin. And put that in the back lane. The bin lorry will be here first thing in the morning. Yes, Ma. As John Paul emptied the kitchen bin, the precious magazines spilled out. And after a quick glance back towards the house to check his mother wasn't watching, he scooped up the penthouse and pushed it inside his school blazer. There was a small broken fridge in the backyard that had been rescued by his dad from the lane before the scrap man could get it. John Paul opened the fridge door, shoved the magazine inside, and returned to the kitchen. For a moment he felt lightheaded. He'd rescued the magazine, and despite its ordeal in the kitchen bin, it seemed to be in reasonable condition. It looked like his mother had forgotten about it as well. I'm going to get changed and then go and play football in the park, Ma. Is that okay? Sit down, John Paul, his mother said, and his heart sank. Yes, Ma. He pulled out the chair by the kitchen table and sat down. John Paul, don't think I've forgotten about the magazine. Where did you get it? In a hedge in the park. His voice almost a whisper. You're 13 now, and you're probably going to become a randy old man like your father. John Paul noticed an odd smile on his mother's face when she said that. I can't stop the things you young boys think about, but never bring that sort of filth into my house again. Understand? Yes, Ma. Get changed and be back here for 6 for your tea. Yes, Ma. John Paul rushed upstairs and quickly changed out of his school uniform. A small germ of an idea had begun to grow in his brain. He knew it would make him a hero amongst his friends, but more importantly, it would make him a bit of money. John Paul may not have been the sharpest knife in the kitchen drawer, but he had a lot of street savvy, and he knew a money spinner when he saw one. He just needed to work on the details. He picked up his football and headed back towards the kitchen. Opening the back kitchen door, he shouted, Bye, Ma! Down the hall towards the front door, he heard his mother's voice. He quickly took a pair of scissors from the drawer of the kitchen table and darted out into the yard. Opening the rusty fridge door, he grabbed the penthouse magazine and shoved it up his football jersey. He opened the yard door and ran down the back lane towards the park. John Paul Docherty and the Mucky Mag, Part 2. The park shelter was a concrete horror. There was nowhere to sit, the roof leaked, and a bitterly cold wind swept through the park on its way from the Russian steppes to freeze the fingers off the shipyard workers on the River Tyne. John Paul shouted to his friends, Shifty, Robbo, come over here and see what I've found. John Paul had known Shifty since the first year of Sacred Heart Primary School. They were the mortal enemies of the park keeper and a pain in the backsides of their mothers. The 3 pals sat down on the rubbish-strewn floor of the shelter. John Paul pulled his shirt up and pulled out the magazine. Look, have you ever seen anything like this in your life? They each gasped as each page was turned. They pointed, but mostly they just gawped at the pictures of the naked young women. Shifty took his one good eye off the page and turned to John Paul and said, I'll buy it off you. How much? It was not always possible to know where Shifty was looking, After he lost one eye in a bike accident 3 years ago, his glass eye had the habit of not moving when the other one was looking elsewhere. Robbo quickly followed with "No, me, I'll buy it." Robbo was the adopted son of Mr. and Mrs. Robinson. Mr. Robinson was the church organist at St. Robert's, and Mrs. Robinson was the chairwoman of the Catholic Women's Guild. They were unctuously pious people who liked to remind everyone that their son was adopted, usually followed by "he came from a bad home," much to Robbo's embarrassment. "Nobody's buying it, at least not yet." John Paul took out the scissors and started to cut out one of the pictures. He held it and said, "1 picture, 1 penny. Here's how it's going to work, and it's how we're going to make a fortune. We cut up the magazine, we take the pictures to school, and we sell them. I'll give you 10 pictures, you pay me 8 pence, and when you sell 10 for a penny each, you make 2 pence. 5 pennies for 10, Shifty said. 7, John Paul held out his hand. 6, said Robbo. The other two looked at him. Shut up, Robbo, or you won't get any. John Paul snapped back. Robbo was going to say something, but he decided to keep quiet instead. It took them nearly an hour of argument to cut up the magazine, as there were often pictures on both sides of the page, and it was a tough call to know which one was the best choice. In the end, there was nearly 100 pictures to sell. Here's the plan. I take them into school, hide them somewhere. You get 10 pictures each. When you sell your 10, you come and see me and give me the 7 pence, and I'll give you another 10. We'll have to be careful. If the teachers or the prefects find out, we'll be in big trouble. Just tell whoever you sell it to. If they're caught, just say they found them. If anyone grasses us up, and they don't get any more, understand? Yes, John Paul, Shifty and Robbo said in unison. The next day, John Paul was ready for school early. Morning, John Paul, his mother said as she appeared in the kitchen. She looked up at the kitchen clock and said, What's up? She knew her sons well enough to know if John Paul was up early, then John Paul was up to something. Usually he was up to no good. I've made porridge for your breakfast. Sit down. Sheila Docherty stared at her son and could see in an instant that whatever it was, it fell into the no-good category. Sport is it today? John Paul looked at his shoes. No, ma'am, he said in a barely audible voice. His mother lunged forward and grabbed his ear and pulled him up out of his seat. Ma, you're hurting me, he grasped out. What are you up to, you little bastard? Tell me now. She pulled even harder on his ear. No, ma'am, let go. I know you, John Paul. You're up to one of your old tricks. Tell me now, because if you don't, and I find out later, and you be sure I'll find out. She gave him another one of her stares. John Paul felt his face flush. No more, I swear. His mother relaxed her grip and he dropped back to his chair. Eat your porridge and get off to school. And John Paul, he looked up at his mother. Yes, Ma. I'm watching you. She reached over the kitchen sink and pulled out a wooden spoon from the washing up bowl and waved it in front of him. We're watching you. John Paul couldn't finish his porridge quick enough. His stomach was in knots, his legs shook, and his face was so hot it felt like his hair was on fire. He jumped up from the table, grabbed his school haversack and its precious cargo, and without looking back, he headed for the kitchen door and out into the back lane. Shifty and Robbo were already waiting for him at the end of the lane. Okay, lads, everything's sweet. Did your ma say anything? Shifty asked. Nah, she didn't suspect a thing. The other two smiled, a not very convincing smile. Me ma asked what I was up to and why I was ready for school before she called me at least 3 times. Robbo said, as he looked around the empty streets to make sure his ma wasn't watching from behind a lamppost. "Look, Robbo," John Paul said as he grabbed the lapels of Robbo's jacket. "Say a word to anyone, and I'll have your guts for garters." John Paul had no idea what garters were or how you made them out of people's guts, but that's what his dad always said to him and his brothers when he thought they were up to no good, so he knew it was a sort of terrible threat. St. Cuthbert's Grammar School was at the end of a long drive. On one side was an old Victorian manor house that was home to the priests who staffed most of the school, and next to it were two long corridors and classrooms that made up the main school. At the far end was the hall that overlooked the school playing fields and the school yard that had been the scene of John Paul's day of shame. Ever since a first-year boy had upended him as he tried to get his dinner money, he'd experienced problems with his protection racket. Groups of first-year boys now gathered in packs for self-protection, and if John Paul attempted to approach anyone, the others quickly gathered and told him to get lost. The local youth club karate class had never been as busy. That's why his new venture was so important. Not only would it make him some money, but might go some way to restoring his battered reputation. The three bandidos went into the cloakroom, and John Paul handed over the first batch of pictures to his two compatriots. "Stick with the older boys. Don't let the prefects see you. Cash up front only, no credit. Understand?" "Yes, John Paul," Shifty and Robbo said in unison. They hurried out into the schoolyard and within minutes returned. "Selling like hotcakes. One lad took 5, Shifty said. "You're not coming out in the yard?" Robbo asked. "I'm guarding the pictures. Now piss off, you two." John Paul smiled to himself. "They're going to take all the risk. I get all the reward," he said to no one. As the bell rang to herald the start of morning prayers, John Paul rattled with coins and his haversack was empty of pictures. "Okay, you two, we meet up in the park tonight and we discuss our next step, okay?" And with that, the three purveyors of pornography made their way into the main hall to say a prayer to thank God and the baby Jesus for a very profitable morning's work. The news of the pictures had spread quickly, and all during dinner time Shifty and Robbo were besieged by eager pubescent teenagers begging for pictures themselves. Those lucky enough to have bought them in the morning were now selling them on for a much higher price, and by the time they went home, some of the more provocative and revealing images were selling for $1. "We need more magazines and we need them fast," John Paul told his two partners in the filthy picture business as they sat on the park shelter floor. "Let's put all the money we made and buy more magazines," John Paul put out his hand to Shifty and Robbo, who handed over their hard-earned cash. "We have a total of 8 shillings, and a penthouse costs 5, so we can get one more for that," said Shifty. "Great idea, Shifty," said John Paul. "Exactly what I was thinking." "The newsagents won't sell penthouse to kids, and even if they did, the Mars would know about it before we left the shop," Robbo added. John Paul and Shifty looked at each other. The smiles on their faces and the thoughts of easy cash disappeared in a mist of problems and disappointment. The three of them sat staring at the broken swings and the burnt-out slide until Robbo suddenly jumped up. "I've got it!" His crestfallen face now sporting a wide grin. "We could steal them," Robbo said. "That's a stupid idea," John Paul sped back. "We get caught." "No, we won't. The shop's always packed on a Saturday. Kids buying sweets, Dad's getting the football pink, and the grandda's after the racing post," Robbo continued. "If we create a distraction of some sort, we could get away with it," Shifty said. "Hang on a minute. I have an idea," John Paul said. "Let's just nick them. Me and Shifty will start a fight between us, and as Mrs. Parker tries to stop us, Robbo grabs a couple of mags." Shifty and Robbo looked at each other. That's what we said." Yeah, well, you give me the bare bones of an idea. I've made a plan, so that's down to me. Shifty and Robbo both shrugged. This Saturday, said John Paul. This Saturday, then, said Shifty and Robbo. John Paul could hardly sleep last night. He now would have at least one, hopefully two, brand new penthouse magazines, unblemished from kitchen waste, and his father sugarless tea to sell. Maybe 16 shillings. No, he thought, I'll double the price to 2p. I'll be £1 and 12 shillings. We would be rich. We could go to the pictures and get ice cream, or maybe even visit the new bowling alley. I could ask Mary McIntyre to go to the Italian ice cream parlour. Oh, maybe take her to the pictures, and in the dark, maybe steal a kiss. And another furtive investigation of a school cardigan. Life was suddenly all possibilities. Parker's newsagent stood on the cusp of the posh streets of Newcastle with its tree-lined avenues and comfortable semi-detached post-war houses and the never-ending terraces of back-to-back workers' houses and flats that stretched in endless rows down towards the giant brewery of Scottish and Newcastle breweries. On that spring morning, Michael Parker took a deep lungful of air that was filled with the aroma of fermenting hops and the heady smell of Newcastle brown ale brewing, and smiled. A new day, a Saturday, the busiest day of the week. I love a Saturday, he thought to himself. It was 6:30 in the morning, and outside his little shop his faithful 3 paper boys were already waiting. Morning, lads. His thick black hair was pushed back in a big swirl, held in place by copious quantities of hair lacquer, and was so stiff you could scrape your hand on it if you touched it. Not that Mike Elvis Parker would let anyone other than his wife Heather touch his hair ever. By day he might have been Mike Parker, the owner of Parker's newsagents, but by night he was Phenom Elvis, as well known in the working men's clubs of Newcastle as the man he'd spent nearly 10 years of his life impersonating on a stage. "Morning, Mr. Parker," the boys replied. At the same time, a van pulled up and disgorged the string-wrapped bundles of newspaper onto the pavement outside the shop. "Great timing, Bobby," Mr. Parker shouted to the delivery driver. "OK, lads," he turned to the trio that were trying to ignore the bundles. "You know what to do. Let's get the shift on. These papers won't deliver themselves." So it starts every day. But today was special. That night he had his first appearance at the Newcastle Labour Club. On a Saturday night there would be 300 men and women packed into the upstairs concert hall. None of them were there to see him. He'd just be the warm-up man before the bingo. That night the headline was the legendary comedian Bobby Thompson. But for Phenom Elvis, this was his chance to shine. As the paper boys sorted the morning rounds, he entertained them all with Viva Las Vegas and Wooden Heart, the 2 new numbers he was adding to the show that night. The regulars to the shop were often entertained by Mike's singing, and though it annoyed some of them, for others it was the highlight of their day. Before long, the newspapers were sorted, the lads loaded up their bikes and cycled off into the grey, misty Newcastle morning. Then came the factory workers, off for the Saturday morning half shift, nurses and doctors from the nearby hospital, weary from a gruelling night shift, all eager to buy their morning cigarettes and sugary sweets. Mike knew the routine of his shop, and he counted off each landmark, knowing it brought him closer to his performance at the Labour Club. 9 o'clock brought the grandad with his football pools tickets to hand in, and the Mars with their little children who were eager to spend their Saturday morning money on licorice sticks, black bullets and sherbet dabs. A small queue was building up when 3 13-year-old boys entered the shop. The first one picked up a copy a Saturday's journal from the newspaper stand and joined the queue. The other two started looking through the comics at the back of the shop. Mr. Parker, seasoned-eyed, spotted them all. He knew Mrs. Robertson's son, the adopted one, but he didn't recognize the other two. He made a mental note to watch them carefully. Suddenly there was a shout, and someone in the queue cried out, "Me eye! I've lost me eye!" Shifty had slipped his glass eye out of its socket and rolled it along the floor. He grabbed the woman in front of him and screamed, "Me eye! Where's me eye?" The woman looked in horror at Shifty's face, his good eye staring back at her, and the empty black hole of the other side of his face seemed to draw her in. Panic began to engulf the queue. Children looked at the teenage Cyclops and clutched their mothers. Even the granddad, who'd seen far worse in the Great War, felt a little uncomfortable. Shifty kept repeating, "Me eye, I've lost me eye." Mr. Parker was always calm in a crisis. Years of standing on stages and working men's clubs had removed the last vestige of fear from him. But even he was beginning to get worried. He shouted through to the back parlour, "Heather, can you come through, please?" Lifting up the counter hatch, he made his way out front and approached the boy. One of the Mars pointed to the newspaper stand and said, "It's there!" And she pointed as if she'd seen a mouse or a huge spider. "There!" She stared at the eye, and the eye stared back at her. Mr. Parker bent over, quickly retrieved the offending glass eye, put his arm around Shifty and said, "Don't worry, son. Everything's okay. Come with me." The two of them passed through the counter. "Heather, pet, take this young man through to the back and help him sort out his eye." He passed her the eye and added, "Probably best to give it a rinse under the tap." He addressed the anxious queue. "Crisis averted, everyone. Now, Mrs. Murphy, what can I do for you today?" And with that, everything returned to normal. In all the chaos, no one had noticed two 13-year-old boys slipping out of the shop. Moments later, Shifty appeared from the side door of the shop, his face restored to its normal spotty and runny-nosed glory, clutching a bag of jelly babies. "Want one?" he said, offering up to Robbo and John Paul. "Mrs. Parker gave me them for nowt." Later, the three amigos sat down in the shelter at Nunsmoor Park. "Okay, has everybody got their scissors?" Shifty and Rob both raised their scissors up. "Yes, boss," they both replied. "Magazines at the ready?" Robbo lifted his jumper and waved a copy of Penthouse, and John Paul did the same. "Okay, guys, let's get cutting." There were a few arguments this time. They had two magazines. It was an easy decision which picture to choose, as they could have both. And soon the two Penthouse magazines were demolished, and John Paul started to put them into his haversack. "What if the Mars find it, John Paul?" "Good point, Shifty. Let's divide them up." The arguments began again. "I want that one. They've all got the coloured pictures. I wanted this one." Until John Paul shouted, "Stop!" He glared at the other two. "This is business. We're going to make money from this, at least 2 pence for every photo. After school on Monday, we add up what we have and see who's... Don't worry about who has what. Think of the ice cream, the bowling alley. I know what I'm thinking of." "Yes," Shifty said with a broad grin on his face. "Mary McIntyre's school cardigan." John Paul slapped Shifty on the back. "Too right, mate, too right." Monday morning came, as Monday mornings always done. In the back lane of John Paul's house, the three budding business tycoons greeted each other. "Everyone got their photos?" John Paul asked. "Present and correct, sir," said Shifty as he stood to attention and saluted his leader. "Present and correct," said Robbo. "Great," said John Paul. The Mars didn't suspect a thing. Let's get on with it. This would be the first and only time they go to school on a Monday morning with a spring in their step and joy in their hearts. In the cloakroom, they hung up their haversacks, covered them with their coats. Shifty and Robbo took a handful of photos and went out to the schoolyard. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around, and before they went in for morning prayers, all 200 pictures had been sold. In Year 6 religious instruction class, There was much giggling and furtive passing of pictures between the boys as Father Rafferty wrote up on the board a selection of Beatitudes he intended to lecture the boys about that morning. Father Rafferty could sense the excitement in the room, and he knew it had nothing to do with the Beatitudes. As he put the final touch to "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied," he quickly turned around and saw Neil Doran furtively put something back into his desk. "Who can tell me what this means?" he pointed with a ruler to the board. No one replied. "Well," he continued as he moved slowly through the row of desks, and as he passed Neil Doran's desk, he slapped his ruler down hard over the desktop. "Mr. Doran, stand up and tell the class what this means." Again, he pointed to the board. Neil Doran stood up, his hands firmly anchored to the desk lid. Father, if you're thirsty or hungry, Jesus will give you food and that." "No, boy, it doesn't mean that." "Hands by your side and stand up straight. There's no slouching in my class. There's none of this in my class, boy." Neil pulled his shoulder back and his arms were stiffly by his side. "Slouching, Father, sorry." In a flash, Father Rafferty had whipped open the desk lid, and there it was, in all its technicolor glory. A bare-chested young woman wearing only a bikini bottom and appeared to be about to throw a beach ball. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," said Father Rafferty as he snapped the picture up. "Where did you get this?" He quickly realized he was spending too much time looking at the picture, and all the other boys in the class were staring at him. "I found it, Father." Neil Doran stuttered. His mouth was as dry and his stomach was doing somersaults. "You're coming with me. Father Cassidy's office now." He went up to the blackboard and wrote on it, "Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God." "Everyone, you get on with your exercise books and write this one down 100 times and think about what it means while you do it. If I hear from the prefect that there was any trouble, then it's detention for everyone. Understood?" "Yes, Father," they all said in unison. And with that, Father Rafferty grabbed Neil's arm and frog-marched him out of the classroom and up to the headmaster's office. As they arrived at the staircase leading to Father Cassie's office, he could already see a small group of some of the other teachers accompanying a gaggle of young boys. "Have you got one as well?" said Father Boyle as he showed him an equally revealing picture of a naked female model enjoying a poolside shower. "It looks very much like the young lady who's playing with the beach ball in my photograph," Father Rafferty added. Father Boyle looked quizzically at Father Rafferty. I mean this boy's photograph," Father Rafferty stuttered. Neil Doran had never seen a priest blush before. Soon priests and lay teachers were huddled around Father Cassidy's desk and were showing more pictures. Father Rafferty made a note of each of these boys and their form masters' names and told them to go back to their class. Father Cassidy, the headmaster, said, "Father Rafferty, make a note of each of these boys and their form masters' names, and when you've done that, get back to their classes. I'll speak to the head boy and get the prefect to do a full search of the classrooms and cloakrooms. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. There'll be a full assembly after the morning break. Please let all the other classes know." After they left, Father Cassidy looked over the photographs and shook his head. Filth, he thought, sinful filth. There'd been this sort of thing in the past, the occasional prefect caught with a dirty magazine. They'd been confiscated, and the prefect disciplined. Indeed, he'd saved all the evidence in a drawer in his filing cabinet. He even checked them every now and again to see if they were still as sinful as he remembered them. But this was on a different level. If this would have been recovered, then there must be more all around the school. During the morning break was all everybody was talking about. Rumour took over, and fear stalked the corridors, but no one was more afraid than John Paul, Shifty, and Robbo. "What will we do?" "We're done for," said Shifty. "It's the spoon for sure," but John Paul was also an optimist, or indeed deluded, depending on your point of view. "No one will say anything. Our haversacks are empty, our desks are clean. We just need to keep quiet. It'll all blow over. Suddenly the bell rang, and teachers and priests and prefects began herding the boys into the main hall. By now, most of the pictures had been discarded during the break, flushed down the toilet or hidden around the sports field. In few cases, some had even eaten the evidence. The hall was now full, and Father Casti entered the stage from the side door. Everyone stood up. The smell of terrified boys pervaded the room, and despite the cold, everyone was sweating. Even those who hadn't even seen any of the pictures were afraid. Justice in St. Cuthbert was arbitrary and indiscriminate. Anyone could be dragged into the headmaster's office and beaten regardless of innocence or guilt. Sit down, boys. I have something very serious to talk about today. It's been brought to my attention that someone has been distributing photographs, not just photographs, but filthy, dirty, sinful photographs. Photographs of young women with no clothes on. The boys responsible need to own up. If you know what it was, then you need to speak up. I will not allow this in my school. Father Casti's face was bright red. He scanned the hall, and every child there felt that he was looking deep into their minds and could read their thoughts. Father Casti's thoughts, however, were based on the images he'd seen, and no matter how much he tried, he couldn't get them out of his mind, and in fact, the more he mentioned them, the stronger the images became. As he continued, his speech became more confusing. He was now stuttering, and despite his inner rage, the words would not come out with the fury he wanted. The pupils of St. Cuthbert's had never seen this version of Father Casti before. They looked at each other, then back at the figure in black robes that stood before them on the lectern. "Breasts, boys, breasts on full display," he suddenly added, then started to shuffle the notes he'd made as he tried to get the images of the photographs out of his mind. The fear the boys had been feeling before was turning into bemusement and then amusement. Suddenly, a disembodied voice somewhere in the hall said, mimicking Father Casti's Irish accent, shouted, "Breasts, boys!" Laughter suddenly filled the room. "Stop this at once! Quiet!" Father Casti screamed. He pointed to a boy in the front row. "Prefects, remove that boy!" Two prefects grabbed hold of the young man and began to frog-march him out. But as they got to the end of the row, someone stuck a leg out, and one of the prefects stumbled. The crowd cheered. "Quiet!" Father Casti shouted. "Boobies!" Another disembodied voice cried out. More laughter erupted. "Shut up now!" Father Casti was losing the room, and he didn't know how to stop it. "Big boobies!" somebody else said. "Quiet! Why is it that every time I open my mouth, some fool speaks?" There was a moment of complete silence, followed by a huge roar of laughter. Father Rafferty could stand it no longer. He marshalled the teachers and the prefect. "Get these boys back to their classrooms now." He rushed over the stage and ushered Father Casti out of the side door and into a small anteroom that was usually reserved for visitors. Father Casti sat down and looked at his deputy head. "What happened in there?" "Let's drop this," Father Rafferty said. "It'll blow over in a few days. The ones we caught will get detention, and if it happens again, we'll come down hard on them. In the meantime, I think maybe a retreat somewhere that's nice and quiet may help." Yes," Father Casti said. "Nice and quiet." That evening in the park, the three friends met up once more. "Mission accomplished," John Paul announced to his two comrades. But instead of joy, all they felt was relief. "Do you think we got away with it?" Shifty asked as he turned around to check with no one else was around. "Yeah, easy peasy," John Paul said in an entirely unconvincing voice. "Let's give up the Mucky Mag business," said Robbo. "I don't know if I could have another day like that." "Listen, you lot, we got away with it. The Mars don't know, and if we have a pocket full of cash, don't flash it about. Let's wait a week or two before we go to the bowling alley, or the pictures once everything's calmed down." Outside the priest's house at St. Cuthbert's, Father Rafferty waved goodbye as Father Casti was driven away to Pluscarden Abbey, where the Benedictine monks would help him recover his fractured confidence. Father Rafferty, now the acting head, looked over at the school hall in the distance. John Paul Docherty, he thought. I know it's you behind all of this. How? I haven't worked out yet, but I know. If you enjoyed this episode, then please support my podcast by buying me a coffee. Click the heart logo in the top corner of the website page and donate. If you're on another podcast provider, then check out buymeacoffee.com and search for Jeff Price N3. Thank you. You can contact Telling Tales direct by emailing tellingtalesjeffprice@gmail.com. Until the next time, goodbye.